Tell me a story in which no one suffers, in which everything is easy, in which no one is mean or cruel to anyone else. You know what your story is? Boring. Do you watch movies without any conflict? Do you waste time on TV shows about everybody getting along? Do you read books where nothing went wrong and so nothing goes wrong and so nothing bad happens because nothing happens at all? No, you don't. Because those movies and shows don't get made. Those books don't get written, and if they do, they don't get published. Those aren't stories. Those are just things that happened. Anyway, they aren't the stories that we want to hear, so they aren't the stories we want to tell. The stories we tell are about suffering, about pain, about overcoming the odds or succumbing to them. It doesn't matter, because either way, we are interested. The news is about terrible things that happen to people who survived them or about terrible things that happen to people who don't. Movies, TV, and books are about conflict getting worse until it's resolved, comedy, or getting worse until the heroes die, tragedy. Your story about waiting in line at the drive-thru is only interesting if the attendant was rude, the order came out wrong, or the food was bad. Otherwise, I don't care. This is indisputably true. But what does it do? The human capacity for suffering is so great because of human sin that we naturally find suffering fascinating. But by being fascinated by suffering because of our sin, by actively pursuing only the stories that interest us, and by only being interested in stories of suffering, what are we doing to ourselves? We don't just stand up for victims. We celebrate victimhood. We idolize heroes only who have overcome some personal hardship. We tell ourselves over and over again that the best version of a person is a person who is suffering or has suffered. And what does that do to us? What are we teaching ourselves? What does it do to our perception of Jesus? To only find interest in his story if he's the victim, the sufferer, the martyr. What if we're teaching ourselves to celebrate suffering and endurance, but without stopping to recognize the purpose behind it? Jesus doesn't matter to us because he suffered. Jesus matters because his suffering earned something that we need. And we don't matter to Jesus because we suffer. We matter to Jesus, and so he gives purpose to our suffering. We're not supposed to want to suffer as much as he did. We're supposed to believe in what his suffering accomplished and to thank him for suffering for us with a willingness to suffer for him, knowing that in our suffering, Jesus still is accomplishing something for us. Sosthenes was a leader in the synagogue of Corinth who was caught up when a crowd brought accusations against the apostle Paul, but was ignored by the Roman proconsul Gallio. Paul was released, and the crowd was incensed, and so they turned on Sosthenes and beat him in front of Gallio, while Gallio showed no concern whatever. That may be all we know about Sosthenes. I can't even tell what side he was on, why he was the one who needed to get beaten. Was he on Paul's team and so he was his scapegoat? Was he leading the crowd and so he was blamed for their impotence before a Roman official? We don't know. We only hear about him getting beaten. He's only interesting to us because he suffered, and we don't even know why. But maybe he's the same Sosthenes as mentioned in the first verse of 1 Corinthians. Maybe he was, for some reason, beaten by a crowd that opposed Paul, and that put him on Paul's team and made him Paul's brother. Maybe we know two things about him: that he suffered and that his suffering drew him to Jesus. Maybe that's your story too. Maybe it's not interesting. Not even with all your suffering. Maybe no amount of suffering will make a story in which you watched some movies and TV, read some books, and waited in line at some drive-thrus interesting enough to be fascinatingly told. Maybe life beats you from time to time and seemingly without any reason at all. And sometimes, in that, you see that you're a brother to the Apostle Paul, or a sister to Sosthenes. You're a child of God because that's what Jesus' suffering won for you. Jesus offers you not a more interesting earthly life, but an eternal heavenly one, and an end to all suffering, because he is the end of your sin. Tell me a story in which no one suffers, in which everything is easy, in which no one is mean or cruel to anyone else. You know what your story is? It's heaven. It's where you belong, because Jesus was the victim for you. There in heaven, you never will be, ever again. Maybe that's not an interesting story, but it is a happy ending. You and I are dust and breath, loved by God, bought by Jesus. This podcast is written and produced by me, Ethan Cherney, a Wells pastor serving Bethel Lutheran Church of Menasha, Wisconsin. Get in touch on Facebook at Dust and Breath Pod, on Twitter at Dust Breath Pod, or by emailing dustandbreathpod@gmail.com. Outro music arranged and performed by Mr. Peter Shawy, who is like an inheritance, is a good thing, and benefits those who see the sun. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you could leave a review in iTunes or just share an episode on social media, I'd really appreciate it. It's the only way other people can find the show. Now, go do what God made you to do. Be who God called you to be. Go see what God can do with dust and breath and faith in Jesus, his Son.